Listen. This violin teacher had been giving music lessons for 12 years, working with dozens of children, helping them find joy in classical music. But when she noticed something troubling about one of her students, subtle signs that most people would miss, what she did next revealed why someone with her training had chosen a profession where she could watch over vulnerable children. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's violin studio was a sanctuary of music in downtown Riverside. Tucked between a bookstore and a coffee shop, the small space was filled with the warm sounds of children learning classical pieces, struggling through scales, and discovering the joy of creating music with their own hands. Sarah had been teaching violin for 12 years, working with students aged 6 to 16. Her approach was patient, encouraging, focused on building confidence as much as technical skill. Parents loved her because their children actually wanted to practice. Students loved her because she made learning feel like play rather than work. What made Sarah exceptional as a music teacher wasn't just her musical training, though she held a master's degree in music education from Juilliard. It was her ability to read children, to understand their emotional states, to recognize when something beyond music was affecting their learning. Her colleagues at the Community Music Center assumed this was natural intuition. Sarah just connects with kids, the director would tell parents. She has a gift for understanding what they need. But Sarah's ability to recognize trauma, to spot signs of abuse, to understand the psychological patterns that affected children's behavior, these weren't gifts. They were skills she'd developed over 15 years as a forensic psychologist, specializing in cases involving child witnesses and victims of abuse. Sarah had worked with law enforcement agencies, testifying in court cases, conducting psychological evaluations for children who'd experienced trauma. She'd been trained to recognize the subtle behavioral indicators that suggested abuse, neglect, or... But this Tuesday, something was different. Sophie was quieter, more withdrawn, holding her violin in a way that suggested physical discomfort. When Sarah helped her adjust her posture, Sophie flinched at the contact. During the lesson, Sarah noticed other concerning signs. Sophie kept pulling at her sleeves, covering her arms. Her concentration was poor, unusual for a child who typically focused well. Most telling was her reaction when Sarah complimented her playing. Instead of smiling, Sophie seemed to retreat into herself. These behaviors individually might be explained by various factors: a bad day at school, tiredness, normal childhood mood variations. But together, they formed a pattern that Sarah recognized from her forensic psychology training. "Sophie," Sarah said gently, "how are things at home? Everything okay with your family?" Sophie's response was immediate and telling. "Everything's fine," she said quickly, then added, "I'm not supposed to talk about family stuff with people." That phrase, "not supposed to talk about family stuff," was exactly the kind of coached response that Sarah had encountered in abuse cases. It suggested someone had specifically instructed Sophie not to discuss what happened at home. Sarah's training kicked in. She needed to be careful, supportive, and professional. Direct questioning could be traumatizing for a child, but ignoring potential abuse signs could be dangerous. Over the next 20 minutes of the lesson, Sarah used techniques she'd learned for working with child witnesses, creating a safe, non-threatening environment where Sophie might feel comfortable sharing information. "You know, Sophie, sometimes when I'm learning new music, I make mistakes, and it makes me feel frustrated. Do you ever feel frustrated or upset about things?" Sophie nodded. "Sometimes." "What kinds of things make you feel that way?" Sophie was quiet for a moment, then said, "When people get angry at me for things that aren't my fault." This was significant. Sarah recognized the language pattern. Sarah watched this interaction with the trained eye of someone who'd testified in dozens of child abuse cases. Mrs. Chen's behavior suggested she wasn't the perpetrator, but was aware of abuse and afraid of it being discovered. After Sophie and her mother left, Sarah faced a decision that drew on both her psychological training and her responsibilities as a mandated reporter. She had reasonable suspicion that a child was being harmed, but she needed to proceed carefully to ensure Sophie's safety. Sarah called the Child Protective Services hotline, something she'd done hundreds of times in her previous career, but never as a music teacher. She provided a professional assessment of the behavioral indicators she'd observed, the concerning statements Sophie had made, and her expert opinion that the child was likely experiencing abuse. The CPS caseworker who took the call was initially surprised to learn that a violin teacher had such detailed knowledge of abuse indicators, until Sarah explained her background. "Dr. Mitchell, given your experience, how confident are you in this assessment?" "Very confident," Sarah replied. "The behavioral patterns, the coached responses, the family dynamics, they're consistent with emotional and likely physical abuse. This child needs immediate attention." Within 2 hours, a CPS investigator was at Sophie's school, conducting an interview using the same techniques Sarah had once used in her forensic practice. Sophie, in the safe environment of the school counselor's office, was able to disclose that her stepfather had been hitting her and her mother, and that both she and her mother had been threatened with worse violence if they told anyone. The investigation revealed a pattern of domestic violence that had escalated to include physical abuse of Sophie. Her stepfather was arrested, and Sophie and her mother were connected with protective services and counseling support. The case made local news. Music teachers' training helps save abused child. But Sarah declined interviews. She didn't want attention for doing what— "I could do some basic training on recognizing signs of abuse and neglect," Sarah agreed. "Nothing that would turn music teachers into therapists, but enough to help them know when to seek help for a child." Within 3 months, Sarah had developed a training program for arts educators, not just at her music center, but throughout the school district. The program taught teachers and instructors how to recognize behavioral changes that might indicate abuse, how to create safe environments where children might disclose problems, and how to properly report concerns to authorities. The training was called Harmonious Child Protection and became a model for other communities. Sarah never officially returned to forensic psychology, but she'd found a way to use her specialized knowledge to protect children while still teaching them to create beautiful music. Sophie continued taking violin lessons, now in a truly safe environment with her mother, who'd left her abusive partner with support from domestic violence services. Sarah watched Sophie's confidence return, her musical skills flourish, and her natural personality emerge from the shadow of fear she'd been living under. "Miss Sarah," Sophie said during a lesson 6 months later, "thank you for helping me when I was scared." Sarah smiled. "That's what teachers do, Sophie. We help our students with whatever they need, whether it's learning music or staying safe." 2 years after the Sophie Chen case, Sarah was offered a position with the state's Department of Children and Family Services, developing protocols for identifying abuse in educational settings. It would mean returning to full-time work in child protection, with significantly higher pay and the opportunity to impact policy at the state level. Sarah considered the offer carefully. It would mean using her full professional credentials again, being recognized for her expertise, and potentially helping thousands of children rather than the few dozen she taught each year. "I appreciate the opportunity," Sarah told the department director, "but I think I can do more good where I am. In my studio, I see children regularly over months and years. I can spot problems early, build trust with family." Sarah's approach had been adopted by arts education programs in 12 states. Music teachers, art instructors, and drama coaches were being trained to use their unique relationships with students to identify children who needed help. But Sarah's greatest legacy wasn't institutional. It was personal. Sophie Chen grew up to become a confident, talented young musician who credited her violin teacher with saving her life. Not just from immediate danger, but by showing her that adults could be trusted to help, that speaking up about problems was the right thing to do, and that she deserved to be safe and valued. So now I gotta ask you guys, have you ever had a teacher who seemed to see beyond the classroom? Who noticed when something was wrong in your life, even when you couldn't say what it was? Drop a comment about the educators who watched out for you, who created safe spaces where you could be yourself, who somehow knew when you needed help, even if you couldn't ask for it. Because here on the Human Stories, we honor the teachers who understand that education is about more than academics. The instructors who use their training and their hearts to protect the children in their care. Thanks for watching, guys. If this story moved you, share it with the teachers in your life who deserve recognition for the difference they make. Hit subscribe to help us celebrate the educators who see their students as whole human beings deserving of safety and support. And the next time you meet a teacher, a coach, an instructor of any kind, remember Dr. Sarah Mitchell. Remember that some of the most important lessons happen when caring adults pay attention to the children in their care and act when those children need protection. Because sometimes the most beautiful music is the sound of a child learning they're safe, they're valued, and they have adults in their lives who will fight for their well-being. That's what real educators do. They don't just teach subjects, they protect the future.